A very warm welcome to everyone in this session, Strategies for Human Security in the Afro-Asian Century. My name is Lynn Kwok, and I'm Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The Asian and African continents enjoy immense economic opportunities. Asia is widely considered to be the center of gravity for economic affairs, and the African Continental Free Trade Area, once fully implemented, is expected to be the fifth largest economy in the world with a potential combined gross domestic product of more than $3.4 trillion. With rising economic powers, countries across these continents are also poised to play an increasingly influential role in shaping global affairs. Their potential is also enhanced by great power competition for influence in the global south. Yet amidst this vast potential, there are also challenges. Amongst them, the quest for human security, a concept that recognizes that security must mean more than the security of the state. Human security emphasizes the security and well-being of individuals, recognizing that threats to people's lives, their livelihoods, and dignity come from a variety of sources ranging from violence, whether in the form of armed conflict or crime, poverty, disease, environmental degradation, or suppression of political rights. This panel seeks to explore whether and how a united Afro-Asian approach can do more to safeguard and enhance human security. The panelists were already introduced earlier, but let me quickly do so again. Monica Busetta, who's Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, Morocco. Dr. Danny Kwa, who's Dean at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Dr. Satoru Nagao, who's a non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute in Japan. And Dr. Kayode Fayemi, who is former governor of the Ekiti State, Nigeria. Very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining me. Danny, let's start with you. Could you tell us how an Afro-Asian approach to human security might differ from the current approach?
Thank you, Lynn, for that question, and thank you all for sharing this afternoon with us in this discussion. Lynn, you've asked me a very difficult question, one that ranges from what happens to individuals for human security, where our concerns are, as you say, basic rights, freedom from hunger, safety in the streets, education, health, to the Afro-Asian century, the possibility of an Afro-Asian century. As we know, the Afro-Asian continent encompasses over 5 billion people. So we're talking at the same time about how something very big can affect something very small. No less consequential, but something that's on a much smaller, more micro scale. I think when we think about these things, what we have to do is to try and understand what happens at the very large, overarching Afro-Asian level filters down to what happens at an individual security level. So let me suggest that there are some ways to think about this. Let me just talk actually about one way to think about this, but then describe ideas that we might have for how we make robust that connection between the Afro-Asian century and individual human security. At the end of that, we will, I think, come to some agreement about what the structure, how that structure operates. But I would like to leave us with some thoughts about principles that we could use to continue to regulate this relation. So one easy way to think about how this relation works is how much does each individual control their own destiny and their environment? How much protection do they get afforded by the state wherever they might live? The idea that an Afro-Asian continent has bearing on individual human security must come from the view that as a community, the Afro-Asian continent can do more for its people than if each individual nation of the Afro-Asian continent stood by itself. There must be the idea that community matters. And so when we think about how we bring about an Afro-Asian century to better provide for human security, we must be thinking about ways in which, by standing together, the whole can do more than the sum of its parts. In other words, we're talking about an Afro-Asian century or an Afro-Asian community. We're not talking about a century of a long list of individual nations. We're talking about an integrated entity. Now, in doing this, what we must do is we realize that we're relying on the idea that each nation, by standing together with others, can achieve more than if it stands by itself. Each nation, by standing with the others, must develop a relation of trust so that it can specialize in doing the things that it does best, but allow others to do the things that they do best and engage in some kind of trustful exchange. The way we can achieve that, it seems to me, is twofold. We can think about how today the international community builds trust across nations. And that twofold way is reflected both in what I think we can build for an Afro-Asian century, as well as reflected in the international institutions we see today. The first of these is build structures, contracts, explicit agreements, and treaties that put in trust and confidence building as one of its ingredients. When we do that, our nation gets into a relationship with a different nation, and we can both advance better together. So the first idea, build structures of trust, build confidence. The second idea is that the way the international community has historically provided for this trust across nations is to set up rule of law, international rule of law, systems of rules that implicitly bring about inadvertent cooperation. Structures that build confidence and trust allow my nation to work with your nation in an explicit collaboration. An international rule of law allows my nation to work with your nation in an inadvertent cooperation, even without explicit treaties. So I think if we're going to be building an Afro-Asian community for an Afro-Asian century, we've got to come up with some way to bring about a mix of these two ideas: structures for explicit trust, or a system of rules of an Afro-Asian community that has a rule of law that allows us to inadvertently cooperate with one another. These two structures, by the way, structures for trust and structures of rule of law, are what already exist in the world today. But many of us feel they don't work well enough. We think about tearing them down and replacing them, or we worry that they put in place a tilted playing field that advantages one side of the world rather than another. So if we go forwards, building an Afro-Asian community for an Afro-Asian century, we've got to put in place principles that prevent this distortion from happening. Let me take 30 seconds and tell you what my ideas of those principles are. The first principle is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We today are in a situation where the international system is changing for geopolitical rivalry. We today are trying to figure out how to navigate an increasingly fragmented landscape. Don't wait until all of this resolves, until all of us can see a way clear through before we start building an Afro-Asian community. Don't let the perfect stand in the way of the good. The second principle is go with what works. Even if you don't think it's ideal, that's of course the same reflection of the same idea. But let me give you an example. If we put in place a plank of operation for our community that helps lift the marginalized, the weak and vulnerable in my nation, I should not let it bother me that it helps some other nations even more. Don't go into this building of an Afro-Asian community with a zero-sum mindset. Anything that helps, helps. Then my third principle, and I'll end here, is constantly look for ways to make the system better. If you begin with the idea of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, you've already put in place something that works. Don't be afraid to change it. In a world where revisionism can improve things, revisionism should be welcomed. Don't defend the international system or the Afro-Asian system that we are building in case we are simply holding on to a rule that we think works. Constantly innovate on our community. So I'd like to leave us with those three principles for how we take things forward. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Danny. I really liked how you highlighted that the assumption that an Afro-Asian approach might work better, underlying that assumption is the sense that a community works better than the individual nation, and that's a very important takeaway, I think, from what you just said. You talked about building structures of trust. One thing that struck me from the discussion this morning was how the South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation highlighted that there are 20 ongoing armed conflicts on the African continent. This figure really struck me, and I actually went away to fact check it, not because I didn't believe the minister, I just thought I might have misheard the amount because it seemed so high to me. But when I checked it, I looked up what came up first in terms of the searches was the Geneva Academy statistic, which must have used a different methodology for what constitutes an armed conflict. And it said that there are 35 ongoing armed conflicts in the African continent. Now, turning now to you, let me try to pronounce this correctly, Kayode. Do you think it's possible to build trust across the African and Asian continents if at home there appears to be so little trust as would be apparent from the armed conflicts waging in this continent?
Thank you, Lynn, and it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel. Yes, generally we say that charity begins at home before you start reaching out to helping others. But in this case, you need to define what home is. The world that we live in is not a world in which the home is just constricted to the geographic space within which you exist. Because what affects your neighbor or even countries further afield can undermine your own human security objectives. And particularly so in a world that is in a state of flux. If you look at our history, there's no way we can talk about the Afro-Asian Century without casting our mind back to Bandung, 1955, and where that unity of purpose was utilized in the decolonization campaign and project. But at that particular time too, we were responding to a shift in geopolitics, in the global power relations. The 1945, post-1945 world order was emerging. The decolonization project was on. At the time that the meeting in Bandung took place, Many countries on the African continent were not even, quote and unquote, independent or liberated. But leaders of Africa at the time, the Kwame Nkrumahs of this world, the Julius Nyerere, and a number of them, were very clear that the Afro-Asian world needed to work together without facing East or West. In fact, the way Kwame Nkrumah put it in the first non-aligned movement meeting was that we should neither face the East nor the West. We should face forward. And we're back to that particular moment in time in which replacing the machinations of the West with the machinations of the East is not the solution to the global challenges that we face, but ensuring that we work together to build trust, on the one hand, as Danny has said, but also to organize the world in such a manner that we all live far removed from freedom from fear and freedom from want, which ultimately is where we have with global governance initiative that can ensure that the spirit that drives us in Africa, Ubuntu, as we've all spoken, does not conceive of the world as a me, myself, and me alone, but the world in a broader context, as Danny has highlighted. So that has to be reflected in the shift that we have ongoing. But in that Gramscian moment in which the old is dying and the new is not yet born, we're bound to witness a lot of confusion. I don't think we should run away from those confusions. I think we should try and find the pathway that would enable the world to hold itself accountable. And if the bulk of the world population, which is in the Afro-Asian section of the world, is not in the driver's seat as co-rule makers, then we're not going to address all of the challenges that we've highlighted. And the Indian G20 leadership helped in addressing that by pushing for the African Union to be at the table as a co-rule maker. What we now need to do on our part, on the African continent, is get our act together and build an African Union that is responsive, that is accountable, and that ensures that the national strategies are organized in a manner that we don't respond to these issues as individual countries, which is a problem. So in doing that, we must strengthen the regional economic communities to also play their role as regional security initiatives. ECOWAS did this when we had challenges in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and SADC did it in Congo, and we need to do more of that. But we need to strengthen national capacities in order to strengthen continental responsibility. That's one. Two, when you look at the direction in which demography is moving, Asia and Africa also need to work a lot more complementarily. I mean, the median age in Africa in the next 30 years, even now, it's 19. In India, it's 28. In China, it's 38. That has implications for what we're discussing in terms of skills development, in terms of migratory effects. And we can begin to organize in a manner that is a win-win for all the players, rather than the way we see migration as a negative now in many parts of the world. And I believe that the Brazilian leadership of the G20 has to have this as one of the major issues to focus on. I also think it's absolutely important, as we're talking about human security, to address the structural drivers in the transformation agenda. Poverty, inequality are the structural drivers of conflict in many of our states. Africans don't just wake up to pick up guns to say they want to kill one another. We must look at this beyond just the neoliberal democratic framework that is really not delivering the goods in many of our countries, and it's now triggering conflicts, coup d'etats, insurgency, extremism of all types. So if we don't address the structural drivers of conflict in poverty, in inequality, perhaps in the way that it's been done in many Asian countries, and learn some lessons from that, we may not be able to fundamentally play that role as co-rule makers. We will still be corralled either by the East, in all of the invitations that Minister Pando was talking about. We get dragged to Washington this month for meeting with Biden, and the next month we go to Belt and Road Initiative in China, and we leave there. We go to St. Petersburg for the Russian dimension of that, without really deciding amongst ourselves what is our own agenda. The people we're going to meet have agenda, short, medium, long term. We must also define our own agenda and develop a strategic framework that is not based on individual countries' principles. That, for me, would be first principles there.
Thanks so much. I think what I took away from that is that perhaps, the bridging between, creating a bridge between Africa and Asia in terms of that community might also lead to positive externalities within Africa, and the greater ability or the enhanced ability to build Africa's own agenda, right? So that increases bonding ties as well. So both bridging as well as bonding ties are increased as a result of this Afro-Asian community. I'll turn now to Munia, and thank you for your patience. Munia, you've held various government positions. You were Secretary of State to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Morocco. You've worked in the Ministry of Industry and Trade. As a practical matter, how might we arrive at a joint Afro-Asian approach or a community, perhaps by virtue of greater economic integration, which Coyote also mentioned earlier?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn, for giving me this opportunity, and I want also to thank the organizer for giving me this possibility to participate to this important conference. As you say, the human security is, of course, related to stability, and stability is related to prosperity and development, and the issues of economic issues are very important to address the question of human security. And as you know, Africa and Asia represent groups of diverse countries, each variable population and variable geographies and structure of economy and highly variable GDP per capita. So we are sharing the same issues and the same challenges. And by the next century, we know that 80% of global population is expected to live in Africa or Asia. And to tackle the big challenges like human security, it's important to consider the trend of demographics. And that means that we have to consider united approach, innovative approach, inclusive approach, taking into consideration both Africa and Asian nations to address or to generate sustainable solutions. So, in practical manner, I will highlight which kind of economic relation we can build between African and Asian nations, because that is very important to create conditions for development and for human security. And I think there is opportunity to develop the global value chain and to be a major player in a global value chain, but that means that we have to reorganize or to create new approach of collaboration and partnership at economic level. First, we know that Africa is a market of raw materials, and we have more than 80% that are exported. And Asia are also Asian nations are also providing technology, and it seems that to be very complementary economies. But it's not enough. If you want to generate added value, if you want to be competitive in sustainable manner, it is important to change the way how we are building our partnership and how we can create a more balanced cooperation. That means that we have to invest at I think, 4 levels. The first one, how can we improve the investment or foreign investment and targeting more added value, especially in agribusiness, in industry, in services, and create more opportunities, more diversify our economy. Until now, we know that our relation between African nations and Asian nations are very limited to investment in extractive industry or exportation of raw materials, but there is no generation of real added value. And if we invest more on that, it will mean that we'll have both opportunities, both for African and Asian countries, and that will create, of course, many opportunities of employment for population, and that means that there is more prosperity. Other point, in my sense, is how we can create connectivity. Because even that we multiply investment and trade between our countries, without connectivity, without infrastructure development, without diversifying or expanding our network of transportation, creating more digital platform and harmonizing our policies and standards, it will not benefit to our economy because there will be all-time barriers to that. So to be more practical, I think we have some issues that we have where we can cooperate, we can create more opportunities. The third point should be how we can develop the human capital by, even that we have demography in Africa, but we need skilled people. So we can develop more programs for scholarships, for transfer of technology, capacity building. And that should be very important to support what we have as ambition, how we can address global challenges, how we can address global issues. If you don't have skilled people, prepared people, it will not be possible. And the fourth point, the last point, should be governance, of course, and climate business. We have, as African countries, we have a lot to learn from Asian experience, and I think that should be one big issue, I think, where we can cooperate, where we can learn from each other. So as Moroccan, we strongly believe that integration is key issue to development. It means that we should invest on integration as continental level. For that reason, free trade agreements we support it because we consider that will help and foster the development to that, but also how we can create sustainable bridges with other continents like Asian nations where we can have common market to address, and we, as I said, we can have a major role to play. So that's, for me, are very important issues where we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, connectivity, I think you highlighted, and I think if we talk about an Afro-Asian century or forging stronger ties, connectivity is really at the heart of that endeavor. You know, we hear in the media a lot about the various connectivity plans that various powers have put forward. The US has a version, Europe has the Global Gateway, China has its Belt and Road Initiative. You know, the US and Europe have come together to work on their collective initiative as well. Of those various initiatives, what do you think, which do you see as the most prevalent on the African continent? And do you see a need to forge partnerships with any other countries in particular as well?
Okay, thank you. I think what we need is to consolidate our partnership. If we have partners that came with added value, it's very important, and sharing the same values, that will be necessary, because it's not a question of having more actors around the table, but it's how we can generate added value, how we can we go faster. And that's, I think, it will be very important. And if we have a partner that could support us, that will be very benefit.
And when you talk about values, what do you mean in particular?
values also what we are sharing. We have to contribute and to have partnership in sustainable value, respecting human, respecting our freedom, and respecting also what we have as resources. So that's, I think, it's very important in the relations.
Satoru-san, thank you for your patience. We heard this morning about the very fraught geopolitical landscape and its worrying implications for Africa. And of course, in the context of infrastructure development, we've seen that geopolitical competition play out. How, in your view, might geopolitical developments, in particular great power competition, hurt or even help the ability to forge an effective and durable Afro-Asian approach to human security?
Okay. Human security is a topic, and my background is national security. That's why I want to talk about the relation between two. So in this case, your question is perfectly matched with my specialty. Indeed, in 1990s, human security was very popular. Why? Because national security cannot cover some important issue of the security. That's why human security is important. But I need to say, without national security, there is no human security. So in the national security, what happened recently? Indeed, the most important situation or issue is friend or enemy. Especially since Russia's aggression in Ukraine, many countries demand which side. And especially since China's aggressive activity in the Indo-Pacific, yes, countries demand which side. But this issue, not only focusing on national security issue, indeed covering every security-related issue. For example, the drinking water from Fukushima nuclear plant. This is not a defense military issue, but now Japan mixed with seawater, and this water is very safe. IAEA checking again, and the US ambassador come to Fukushima, ate fish from this area, or the Australian ambassador came, or EU removes the ban, or even if South Korea, which blame Japan every time, is a restriction to import fish from here. But despite this, China banned to import fish from Japan. And 1 month later, Russia followed this action. Why? Fact, this is safe. But fact is not the matter. Friend or enemy is the matter. So that's why if the enemy say this is orange, enemy's friend say this is orange, despite this is apple. That is the current world. So infrastructure project, same situation. Asia, Africa growth corridor, which is India and Japan project, or Indo-Pacific vision, Blue Dot Network. These are the US side, Japan side vision against China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So, but in this case, which side you are is very important. So, unfortunately, this is the situation, and this is the situation we need to exploit it. So, view from the Japan's experience after the World War II, we can compare the US occupation and the Soviet occupation. And we understand that US is better than Soviet, because Soviet troops come to the shop and start to eat. And the shopkeeper asks the Soviet soldier, could you please pay? The Soviet soldier pulls a gun and kills the shop owner. So that is common. That's why we start to understand the US side was better because of the occupation, because of we lost the war in the World War II. So that's why we want to talk about people in South Africa. It is understandable South African people take distance from the West because former colonial master or the cause of the apartheid is Western countries. But at the same time, I want to say South African people is courageous people, strong people, and the people to change the history finally to get proper human rights. So that's why, as a Japanese, I would say, South Africa choose the right side. So what do I want to say is join us. That's all. Thank you very much.
Perhaps before I turn to Q&A from the floor, I'd like to turn again to Coyote to ask whether or not your sense is similar to my colleague's sense over here about how China is a threat to Africa. That's the first question. I mean, I'd like you to address this quite quickly, whether China is perceived as a threat or more as a contributor to human security in the African continent. And second, perhaps you could also address whether you think great power competition has diverted resources away from the African continent or has instead increased attention to the African continent where you have superpowers competing to be benefactor and even more generous to Africa.
Thank you. Well, I think we are at a point of inflection and it presents opportunities for Africa. Frankly, I think the word to use will be the opportunity for strategic autonomy. Which is not very different from what the foundational leaders of Africa pushed for at Bandung and the non-aligned movement. It's the same agenda that the post-millennium leaders, President Mbeki, Abdoulaye Wade, Obasanjo, pushed in the new Partnership for Africa Development and the Africa Renaissance Program. And this principally focuses on Africa itself. What's our interest? And once we figure that out, as defined in the Africa 2063 agenda, which is to work towards a united, integrated Africa. That's aspirational, I know, but that's the beginning. You need to be clear about your objective and then work towards it. Anybody who wants to come to Africa now needs to come and figure out to contribute to that agenda, not to force Africa and African states into this competition. We clearly must define our agenda, and the critical issues at the moment are not even necessarily ideological. Climate change, pandemic, these are things that are existential threats, not just to Africa, but the rest of the world. But how it affects Africa, either in vaccine production and distribution or in other elements associated with that, is something that we need to clearly define and then work towards the best way to get African advantage. I think that's really what we should focus on. Geopolitical competition will continue. We're not going to stop it. But what is in our interest and how do we pursue that interest as a co-rule maker, not being corralled into the agenda of either side. And I think that's really what the G20 program in India seemed to have pushed to the forefront. And global Africa, as well as global South, would need to work together in achieving this purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. So no permanent friend or enemy, if I'm hearing you correctly, but a clear sense of African interests. And then from there, you determine the best means or the best partners for achieving those interests. Thank you. Now I turn to the floor. Are there any questions from the floor, please? Thank you very much. And if I could ask that you identify yourself for the audience and also state to whom your question is directed.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I'm Otilia Anamaunganidze from the Institute for Security Studies. I'm mindful that there's very little time for actual questions, so maybe just a couple of comments. The first is that there were a number of words that I hoped to hear in this session that I didn't. Those are accountability, inclusivity, equality, and justice. Seemed more focused on other aspects of human security and not those. The other two, and very briefly, is of course Asia and Africa are the two continents for which remittances have really helped development, helped communities, would like to hear the thoughts of anyone, really, on how we can be able to leverage remittances into the African and Asian continents for the benefit of both. Then finally, education. If we agree that Asia and Africa are young continents, even as Africa is much younger than Asia, what do we have to say about educating not the youth, but actually right from the start? So from infancy onwards, so not focusing only when we have a discontent in the late teens, but earlier on. What do we have to say about how that can help shape the African Asia of the future? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lia Matanda, and I am in my second year of BA International Studies. And my question is general for the panel. There's a mini narrative that's being pushed in coursework that this is a new version of neo-colonialism. And I just want to ask, how can we make sure that we're not falling into that trap? And I know that you spoke about how intentions need to be set, but I think from a perspective coming from coursework, this could be seen as a way to sort of mask and subsidize a way to colonize Africa, for lack of a better phrase. So my question is, how can we level it out for people like me to understand, the youth that you've been referring to the whole day? How can we understand what you're talking about and know that we are safe?
Hi, my name is Julia Rapnifard. I'm from the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And my question is to Dr. Denny Kwah, if I may, and it's about Southeast Asia. But I think the same question pretty much can be extrapolated to Africa as well. So I wanted to ask how, in your opinion, the US-China rivalry in our region, in Southeast Asia, plays a role in the growing disregard for human security, or maybe you are of a different opinion and it actually benefits human security in Southeast Asia in any way. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So we have a series of questions. The lack of mention of accountability, inclusivity, and justice. I would have actually liked to ask a question related to that, like how, in coming up with a model for human security, an Afro-Asian model for human security, we bring in the best elements and leave out some of the worst. Perhaps we can have Coyote answer that question, and the question of remittances. Munia, would you like to address that?
I think it's an excellent question, but without holding brief for my colleagues, I think we've all assumed that those are set principles and values that have been agreed by all in mutual trust, accountability, justice. These are the values undergirding the work of this group. And I believe that it doesn't require, given the time limit that we have, any elaboration. But I do want to say one thing in respect to that. I mean, some significant development occurred, I think it was last 2 weeks, when the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, voted on the reform of the global tax regime in order to stem illicit financial flows. And if you see the way that vote went, which was 125 against 38, with all of the OECD countries voting in one direction and majority of countries in Asia and Africa voting in another direction to, of course, close all these tax havens and all these avenues for tax, for blocking tax justice in the world. And I think that speaks to the question also about remittances. Ultimately, the reform of the global governance structure, particularly the Bretton Woods institution, is one that I believe African and Asian nations pretty much agree on. And in the event that that's not possible, I think that's the role that a body like BRICS has in defining a new vehicle for ensuring this accountability in the global governance structure. And I think that's something that we really ought to be pushing very hard on here. That essentially would be my short answer to that question. But yes, the values of accountability, we must hold one another accountable. There must be peer pressure, positively, not just in the other direction, to ensure that what we're accusing the West of is not replicated by a partnership that is tilting towards the East. That really must be one thing that Africa pushes against.
Thank you. Munia, would you like to address any of those questions?
I can add some answers to what have been said, because when I highlighted 4 aspects considering the economic perspective, 2 points was related to values, and I said governance is very important, and governance with inclusivity and accountability and diversity and all the principles. The second point, it was related to human capital, and it means that we have, of course, to invest in skilled people, and how can you create more capacity building and different program and scholarship, what is very important. Because without human capital, we can't achieve what we have as targeted. And it was the question about the new colonialism, if you can say that. But I think that was very important. And when I addressed the perspective of economic, that we should have a balanced relationship. And this balanced relationship should not focus just on the Africa as markets of raw materials. It should be as partner with who we can create added value, we can develop agribusiness supply chain, industry, energy. So this spirit is very important, yes, to have very sustainable relations and to be engaged and committed to face all the different challenges, especially human security.
Thank you. And Satoru-san, would you like to address any of the questions? If not, I'll turn to Danny.
When I hear the question, I realize that maybe new colonialism, the mindset of the colonial is still existing in Africa. That it's itself, maybe we should solve, I believe, because Africa is a rising region now, and Asia is rising region now. So this means that we do not need to worry about a new type of colonialism now, because rising means that you will be the center of the world politics. That's why you do not need to worry about the experience in the past. You will lead the world, you will be part of the world, and if there is a democratic system, you can vote to decide some part of the world politics. So maybe don't worry about this, just raise a hand and claim and get it. That is my answer, thank you.
Thank you. So look towards the future, less towards the past. On that, we now move to Danny, the question on how the EU, or whether the EU plays a role in human security in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Lynn. To answer that question, may I just touch on some of the other questions as well and just make 3 very quick points. First, on the question about accountability and justice. Those are obviously very important issues, but at the level that we are discussing matters here, it seems to me that we need to take an international approach, and we cannot be seen to be conjuring up constructions on an Afro-Asian century that interfere or intervene in individual nations. National sovereignty still matters. And the level at which we're discussing these things, I think there are many things that each nation will need to continue to do to fix up governance in their domestic landscapes. It's not for the international observers to pronounce on that. But that's also the same answer I would give to a number of other points, including the point about US-China rivalry. The best way forward, it seems to me, given the range of concerns that have been raised, is still multilateralism and a level playing field. And if the full-blown multilateralism across the entire international community is no longer available to us, some kind of restricted multilateralism that confines itself to the nations that are willing to enter that coalition needs to be that taken forwards. That means that we respect each nation's individual national sovereignty, and we cannot meddle in the domestic affairs of individual nations. Instead, we stand on principle, and we do not allow, or we do our best not to allow external factors like US-China geopolitical rivalry and competition to impinge on our holding on to the principles of multilateralism. That, it seems to me, is the way we need to continue to approach the Afro-Asian continent and the Afro-Asian century. Thank you very much.
Thank you all, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our wonderful panelists, and I thank you all for your patience and your interest in this session.